Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a journey that honestly defied all logic for its time, Marco Polo's absurd, epic road trip. We're talking about a massive 24-year odyssey that completely flipped how the Western world viewed the East. And look, this isn't just some dusty historical timeline. No, this is the wild story of a teenager who basically walked out his front door and accidentally became the most famous traveler in human history. So think about it. Have you ever embellished a vacation story just to make it sound a little bit cooler? Maybe the fish you caught was a little bigger, or that hike you did was practically a vertical cliff. We all do it. Now take that very human instinct and multiply it across a 24-year journey. Imagine coming back from a weekend getaway and casually dropping into conversation that you ran into men with dog heads, or, oh yeah, you saw literal unicorns roaming around. That right there, that's the essence of Marco Polo. He was a guy who saw genuinely impossible things, but he definitely wasn't afraid to sprinkle a little extra spice on top to keep his audience hooked. All right, let's set the scene. The year is 1271, and a 17-year-old kid named Marco Polo leaves the wealthy, bustling city of Venice with his dad and his uncle. The goal? To travel all the way to the court of the Mongol emperor in China. And remember, they don't have Google Maps. They don't have commercial flights. None of that. This was a brutal 3.5-year trek. They went across the Mediterranean, straight through the Middle East, over the freezing, towering peaks of the Pamir Mountains, literally known as the roof of the world, and then right across the treacherous Gobi Desert. And the things he saw along the way, they bordered on the completely surreal. He reported seeing the actual resting place of Noah's Ark, perched up on Mount Ararat in Armenia. He talked about running into astrologers, shamans, and magicians who could supposedly control the weather. But here's where the tall tales actually slam right into historical fact. He described seeing these fountains of black oil in Mesopotamia that just burned constantly. He had no idea what it was at the time, obviously, but Marco Polo was actually giving the Western world one of its very first written descriptions of petroleum. How crazy is that? So after 3.5 grueling years, the Polos finally make it. The year is 1275, and they arrive at Xanadu, the majestic summer capital. Just picture this. This young, wide-eyed teenager from Venice drops to his knees in front of Kublai Khan. This is the grandson of Genghis Khan. We are talking about the most powerful ruler on the face of the earth. And the crazy part? The Khan is instantly charmed by him. You see, Kublai Khan wasn't just your standard conqueror. He was a real visionary. He valued knowledge, he valued diversity, and honestly, he just loved a really good story. He saw right away that Marco was incredibly smart. In fact, Marco picked up 4 different local languages while he was there. The Khan was so hooked by Marco's eye for detail that he basically decided, nope, I'm not letting this kid go back home. Instead, he makes the young Venetian his personal emissary. He sends him on these diplomatic missions all across the empire, and eventually he even makes him a regional governor of a Chinese province for 3 whole years. And the luxury Marco witnessed at Xanadu, it sounds like it was ripped straight out of a fantasy novel. He described this massive palace made entirely of golden bamboo that could literally be taken down and moved around. He wrote about the Khan keeping 200 trained falcons. He even described the Khan riding out to hunt on horseback with a literal leopard sitting right there on the back of the horse. But okay, my absolute personal favorite detail? The Khan loved beautiful trees so much that if he heard about a nice one somewhere, he'd have it dug up, roots and all, and moved to his palace using a huge team of elephants. Just unbelievable wealth. But of course, it wasn't just architectural marvels. Marco leaned heavily, and I mean heavily, into the bizarre. He claimed he heard about islands full of primitive men with the heads of dogs. He described an island off the coast of Oman where men and women lived completely separate from each other. He talked about cannibals worshipping live animals. And, naturally, he excitedly reported seeing actual unicorns roaming the wilderness. Now, to be fair, his description of these unicorns having thick, hairless skin and a single black horn on their snout, yeah, it makes it pretty obvious to us today that he was just looking at some very grumpy rhinoceroses. So here's the crucial takeaway. Yes, Marco definitely spun some tall tales, but the actual, verified facts he brought back, they were even more mind-blowing. Let's just compare the realities for a second. When Marco left home, Europe was super fragmented. They were still relying on really primitive trade systems, lugging around heavy metal coins, dealing with highly localized economies. But what Marco discovered in China under the Mongol Empire, it was this massively interconnected, highly advanced civilization operating on a scale that Europe literally couldn't even fathom at the time. Forget the unicorns. The verified wonders of the East were what actually shocked Europe. For starters, Marco introduced the concept of paper money. He described pieces of paper stamped with red seals being traded exactly like pure gold. To a European merchant hauling around giant heavy chests of coins, that sounded totally ridiculous. He also detailed this hyper-efficient postal relay system with 10,000 post houses and 200,000 horses. He talked about people burning black rocks for heat, which, you guessed it, was coal. He described massive suspension bridges and a super delicious rice wine that apparently got you drunk way faster than the grape wine back home. Just tracing the timeline of this epic journey is wild. He departs Venice in 1271, arrives in 1275, he spends 17 incredible years serving the Khan. Then, finally, in 1292, the Khan reluctantly lets the Polos go, but he tasks them with this deadly escort mission by sea to take Princess Kokachin to Persia. A lot of people died on that voyage, but Marco survives, and he finally makes it back to Venice in 1295. He had been gone for so long that his own family thought he was dead. Nobody even recognized him until he ripped open his ragged coats to show them a literal fortune in hidden jewels. But the kicker, by 1298, after surviving the entire Silk Road, the Mongol Empire, and the high seas, Marco gets home only to get thrown into a dungeon during a local naval war between Venice and Genoa. Talk about bad luck. And that brings us to a huge plot twist. The most famous travel book in human history? It wasn't written at some grand mahogany desk in a fancy Venetian villa. Nope. It was dictated from a dirty, cramped prison cell. In fact, Marco Polo didn't actually write a single word of his own book. The guy who actually put pen to paper was Marco's cellmate, a man named Rustatello de Pisa. Now, Rustatello was a writer of Arthurian romances. He knew exactly how to craft a bestseller. So when he's sitting in this cell, hearing Marco tell these absolutely unbelievable stories to the other prisoners, he strikes gold. He tells Marco, hey, organize your thoughts, and together they produce Il Milione, or The Million, which is way better known today as The Travels of Marco Polo. Now, there's this absolutely fantastic anecdote about Marco's time in prison that I think just perfectly captures exactly who he was. Legend has it that the great poet Dante Alighieri, the guy who wrote the Divine Comedy, actually visited that very prison and met Marco. Dante, being this massive intellectual, fully expected to sit down and have these profound, sweeping philosophical debates with this worldly traveler. But as the story goes, Dante left incredibly disappointed. Why? Because all Marco Polo wanted to talk about was where they could find some women. It is just a hilarious reminder that, at the end of the day, Marco was a merchant and an adventurer, not some high-minded philosopher. But all this does bring us to a pretty serious question, one that historians have basically been arguing about for centuries. Did he just make it all up? Skeptics love to point out some really glaring omissions in his book. Think about it. For a guy who supposedly lived in China for 17 years, he never once mentions the Great Wall of China. He doesn't mention drinking tea. He says literally nothing about Chinese character writing, and he never even mentions chopsticks. Because of this, some historians argue that, hey, maybe he never actually made it to China at all. Maybe he just hung back and collected all these stories from Persian merchants along the route.
But look, we really have to acknowledge his undeniable legacy, whether it was fact, fiction, or a mix of both. Most modern historians agree that, yeah, Marco definitely exaggerated his own importance, like maybe he wasn't exactly a governor, and he for sure included secondhand myths. But the core of his journey, it's true. The incredibly specific architectural, geographic, and economic details he provided about the Mongol Empire were completely unknown in Europe at the time. He fundamentally shattered their tiny worldview and vastly expanded their understanding of the globe.
You honestly cannot overstate the legacy of those prison writings. When Marco's book dropped, it was an absolute sensation. It got translated into multiple languages, copied over and over, and spread all across the continent. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and this navigator named Christopher Columbus was so inspired by Marco Polo's wild descriptions of the endless riches of the East that he literally carried a heavily annotated copy of Marco's book with him on his own voyage in 1492. Marco Polo, a guy telling stories in a jail cell, essentially helped map the mindset of the entire age of discovery. And that brings us to my absolute favorite part of this entire story. Marco Polo ends up living a long, wealthy life back in Venice, eventually passing away at around 70 years old in 1324. As he's lying there on his deathbed, a concerned relative urges him to just finally recant his stories, confess to his lies and save his soul before meeting God. But Marco Polo looks at them completely defiant and delivers this absolute mic drop of a quote: "I only told half of what I really saw." I mean, it just leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What impossible marvels, what bizarre secrets did Marco Polo actually take to his grave? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning what lies just beyond the edges of the map.